The mahogany gavel didn't just strike the block, it shattered the suffocating silence of courtroom 3 billions. Across the aisle, my mother's polished facade cracked, her fingers digging so hard into her designer handbag that the leather groaned. Beside her, my brother Julian stared at the floor, his face draining of color as the heavy oak doors behind us felt miles away. 5 minutes ago they had smiled at me with the cold, predatory satisfaction of wolves closing in on a kill. Now the judge wasn't even looking at them, he was looking at the small, rusted brass key resting on the center of his dais. "This court is adjourned," the judge said, his voice dropping like an iron curtain. "And God have mercy on how you handle the truth. My name is Arthur Pendleton. At 34, my life is measured not in grand achievements, but in the precise, quiet margins of restoration. I am a master horologist, a clockmaker. My days are spent in the soft amber glow of a basement workshop in the heart of Silver Lake, surrounded by the steady rhythmic heartbeat of 100 antique timepieces. It is a solitary profession, one that demands absolute stillness, surgical precision, and an infinite amount of patience. Every morning begins exactly at 5:30 a.m. I grind precisely 20 grams of coffee beans, brew them in a faded ceramic press, and sit by the eastern window of the kitchen, watching the fog lift off the valley. I value order. I value things that can be fixed if you are willing to understand their internal mechanics. People, I learned long ago, do not possess such reliable gears. My greatest emotional wound is not a mystery to those who know my family. It is the lingering phantom ache of being the invisible son. While Julian was groomed for corporate boardrooms and showered with praise, I was the awkward boy who preferred the company of broken music boxes. My mother, Eleanor, viewed my quietness as a defect, a structural flaw in the pristine lineage she sought to project. My biggest fear was never poverty or failure. It was the terrifying realization that I could disappear entirely from their lives and no one would notice the silence. Yet I harbored a quiet dream. I didn't care for status or wealth, I simply wanted a space that belonged entirely to me, a sanctuary where the noise of the world couldn't reach me. That dream took the physical form of the house on Ridgeview Drive. It was a sprawling mid-century craftsman bungalow with weathered cedar shingles, wrapped in the protective embrace of ancient weeping willows. It was a house that required care, much like the clocks I restored. In my pocket I always carried a small, tarnished brass key. It didn't belong to the house on Ridgeview, nor did it fit any clock in my shop. It was given to me by my grandfather, Thomas Pendleton, the only man who ever looked at my quiet nature and saw strength instead of weakness. "Keep it close, Arthur," he had whispered to me shortly before he passed away. "When the world loses its rhythm, this will reset the gears." For 15 years it remained a useless token, a heavy piece of brass that anchored me to a memory. The house on Ridgeview Drive became my canvas. I bought it 5 years ago, not with family money, of which I received none, but with the hard-earned savings from restoring high-end estate clocks. It was in terrible shape when I found it. The roof leaked, the oak floors were warped by decades of neglect, and the gardens were overgrown with wild ivy that threatened to swallow the porch. But I saw the beauty beneath the dust. Every weekend, my routine shifted from the micro-world of watch gears to the macro-world of carpentry. I sanded the floors until my hands bled and healed into thick calluses. I replaced the rusted plumbing pipes one by one. I painted the walls a soft, muted cream that caught the late afternoon sun perfectly. My interactions with the neighborhood were brief but warm. Mrs. Gable, the elderly widow who lived down the lane, would often walk past with her golden retriever. She would stop by the low stone wall, watching me work. "You're giving that old place its soul back, Arthur," she would say, her voice carrying the gentle weight of someone who had seen generations come and go. "It just needs someone to listen to it, Mrs. Gable," I'd reply, wiping sweat from my brow. She would smile, leave a small basket of fresh lemons from her tree, and continue her walk. Those small moments of kindness were my anchor. In the evenings, the house was filled with a deep, resonant peace. I installed a grand-grandfather clock in the living room, a 19th-century French masterpiece with a pendulum that swung with a deep, comforting thump-thump-thump-thump. It sounded like a sleeping giant's heart. My family rarely visited. To Eleanor and Julian, my house was an eccentric hobby in a neighborhood they deemed beneath their social standing. When Eleanor did call, her voice was always sharp, filled with passive-aggressive remarks about my lifestyle. "Still playing with toys in the dirt, I see," she would say during our brief, obligatory holiday phone calls. I learned to let the words slide off me. I had my sanctuary, I had my rhythm. Then, Julian's tech startup collapsed. The news didn't come from him, but from the financial columns I occasionally glanced at. It was a spectacular failure, a black hole of debt that swallowed his investors' capital and left his pristine reputation in tatters. I felt a pang of sympathy, but I knew better than to offer advice to a brother who had always viewed me as a lesser being. I kept working, kept sanding, kept winding my clocks, completely unaware that the tremors of Julian's ruin were about to tear my sanctuary apart. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the bell above my workshop door chimed. I didn't look up immediately, carefully placing a microscopic jewel into the escapement wheel of a pocket watch. When I finally set my loop down, a woman was standing by the counter, shaking out a wet umbrella. She wore a tailored navy trench coat, her dark hair pulled back into a practical twist. Her eyes were sharp, analytical, but there was a distinct exhaustion lingering beneath them. This was Clara Vance. "Arthur Pendleton?" she asked, her voice calm and measured. "Yes," I said, wiping my hands on my canvas apron. "Can I help you with a timepiece?" She didn't smile. Instead, she took a seat on the stool opposite my workbench and placed a thick manila folder on the counter. "I'm not here about a clock, Mr. Pendleton. I'm a forensic real estate accountant, and I think you need to look at this." Few weeks, Clara became a permanent fixture in my world, though not in the way either of us expected. She was a woman driven by numbers and unyielding facts, a stark contrast to my world of intuition and patience. Yet, we found a strange, quiet harmony. She would sit at the small wooden table in the corner of my shop, surrounded by mountains of financial ledgers, while I worked on my clocks. We didn't talk much at first. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was the shared quiet of two people who respected focus. But gradually, the barriers eroded. It started with small gestures. I would notice her rubbing her temples from eye strain and silently place a fresh cup of coffee next to her documents. She would notice when I was struggling with a stubborn rusted screw and hold the flashlight without me having to ask. One evening, as the rain drummed a steady rhythm against the shop window, she stopped typing on her laptop. She looked at the grandfather clock ticking in the corner, then looked at me. "Why clocks, Arthur?" she asked softly. I paused, holding a delicate mainspring in my tweezers. "Clocks don't lie," I said after a moment. "If they're broken, they tell you exactly why through their gears. They don't pretend to be something they're not. They just want to find their balance again." Clara leaned back, a faint, melancholic smile playing on her lips. "I wished people were more like clocks. My job is essentially digging through the lies people write into financial code. It's exhausting." "Why do you do it then?" She looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee mug. "Because my father lost his business to a partner who knew how to manipulate the books. He died believing he was a failure. I do this to make sure the math matches the truth. I like giving people their reality back." In that moment, I felt a profound shift in the room. Clara wasn't just an accountant I had hired to look into a minor tax discrepancy on my property. She was a protector of truths. We began spending our dinners together at the small diner across the street, sharing plates of fries and talking about our childhoods. She told me about her dream of buying a small farm upstate. I told her about the peace I found when the house on Ridgeview Drive was perfectly silent. But as our connection deepened, the documents in Clara's folder began to paint a terrifying picture. One night, she called me into the shop after hours, her face pale under the fluorescent lights. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "you need to see what your brother Julian just filed with the county recorder." The emotional question that night was simple yet terrifying. How far could betrayal go? Clara pointed to a digital document on her screen. It was a deed transfer for the house on Ridgeview Drive. The signatures at the bottom were clear: Thomas Pendleton, my grandfather, and Julian Pendleton. The date on the document was listed as 3 weeks before my grandfather passed away, 15 years ago. "This can't be right," I stammered, my chest tightening. "My grandfather left me this house in his written will. I bought out the remaining equity from the estate legally. I have the titles. According to this document, Clara said, her eyes filled with deep concern, your grandfather signed the underlying land rights over to a family trust controlled entirely by Julian and your mother, effective upon his death. Arthur, if this document is valid, your deed is a ghost. They don't just own a portion of your property, they own the dirt beneath your feet, and everything built upon it. The next morning, the reality of the threat arrived in a black sedan. I was painting the front porch railing when the car pulled into my driveway. The doors opened, and Eleanor and Julian stepped out. My mother looked as elegant as ever, wrapped in a cashmere wrap, her eyes scanning my home with an expression of profound disdain. Julian followed her, his posture defensive, his eyes bloodshot and desperate. Arthur, Eleanor said, not offering a greeting as she stepped onto the grass. We need to talk about the estate. You don't have an estate here, Mother, I said, keeping my voice low, my fingers tightening around the paintbrush. Julian stepped forward, his voice sharp, masking his underlying panic. We do, actually. We've been reviewing grandfather's old filings, Arthur. The house you've been playing house in belongs to the Pendleton Family Trust. My trust. We've received an incredibly lucrative offer from a commercial developer who wants to clear this entire hillside for luxury townhomes. The world seemed to stop spinning. The grandfather clock inside the house felt like it was ticking faster, a manic, frantic rhythm. This is my home, I said, my voice dropping an octave. I built this. I restored this. You repaired a sinking ship, Arthur, Eleanor said coldly, stepping closer. And you did it with our family name. Julian is facing an incredibly difficult financial transition. And as a family, we must liquidate our assets. We are prepared to offer you a small percentage of the sale, enough for you to find a suitable apartment closer to your little shop. But you need to vacate by the end of the month. I looked at my mother, searching for a single shred of maternal warmth, a hint of hesitation. There was none. I looked at Julian, the brother who had been given everything, now trying to strip away the one thing I had built with my own hands. No, I said firmly. Julian laughed a harsh, ugly sound. It wasn't a request, Arthur. We've already filed an eviction injunction with the county court. We have the original trust agreement signed by grandfather. You have no legal standing. You have no money for a prolonged legal battle. Don't make this ugly. They turned and walked back to their car, leaving me standing on the porch, the wet paint dripping from my brush like slow white tears. Sat alone in the dark living room, the thump-thump of the grandfather clock offering no comfort. I pulled the small brass key from my pocket, turning it over and over in my fingers. Why did my grandfather give? He had already given everything to Julian. What was the point of the promise? Clara arrived an hour later, carrying a box of old archives she had pulled from the city records. She didn't say a word. She just sat on the floor beside my chair, resting her hand gently over mine, stopping the nervous movement of the brass key. We're going to fight this, Arthur, she said softly. But there's something about that trust document that doesn't make sense. The numbers, the filing dates, they don't align with your grandfather's financial patterns. They're hiding something. We just have to find the missing gear. The legal battle escalated with terrifying speed. Julian's attorneys were relentless, burying us in motions, demands for immediate possession, and character assassinations that painted me as an unstable squatter taking advantage of a wealthy family's charity. They managed to fast-track the hearing, forcing us into an emergency probate and property dispute court within 2 weeks. The morning of the hearing, the sky over the city was a heavy, suffocating gray. I stood outside courtroom 3 billions, my hands freezing despite the wool suit I wore. Clara stood beside me adjusting my tie with a fierce, quiet determination. Remember, Arthur, she whispered, looking up into my eyes. The truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be seen. Keep your composure. We walked into the courtroom. The room was grand, lined with dark oak paneling and illuminated by harsh, recessed lighting that cast long shadows across the benches. Eleanor and Julian were already seated at the plaintiff's table, flanked by two high-priced corporate attorneys who looked at us with patronizing smiles. The judge, an elderly man named Honorable Marcus Vance, no relation to Clara, though his sharp, no-nonsense demeanor matched hers, entered the bench. The room rose, then settled into a tense, vibrating silence. Julian's lead attorney, a man named Henderson, stood up, smoothing his jacket. "Your Honor," Henderson began, his voice booming with practiced confidence. "This is a simple case of clear property entitlement. The defendant, Arthur Pendleton, has occupied the property at 1402 Ridgeview Drive without legal title. The property belongs explicitly to the Pendleton Family Trust, established by the late Thomas Pendleton. We have the original trust deed, signed and notarized 15 years ago, granting full liquidation authority to my clients, Julian and Eleanor Pendleton. We request an immediate eviction order and a judgment for damages." 2. Over his glasses, reviewing the documents in front of him. "Mr. Pendleton," the judge said, looking toward me. "Does your counsel have a response?" Clara stood up. Her voice was calm, clear, and utterly devoid of fear. "Yes, Your Honor. We do not dispute that Thomas Pendleton created a trust. However, we challenge the validity of the document presented by the plaintiffs. We believe the trust agreement submitted today is an incomplete and fundamentally altered instrument." Julian scoffed loudly from the table. Eleanor placed a restraining hand on his arm, her eyes locking onto me with a look of pure venom. "Fanciful claims, Your Honor," Henderson countered, smiling thinly. "The document is notarized. It has stood unchallenged for 15 years. It stood unchallenged because it was hidden in a private vault until Julian Pendleton's business faced bankruptcy 3 months ago," Clara said, stepping forward and placing a fresh set of documents on the bailiff's ledger. "Your Honor, we have subpoenaed the original bank safety deposit logs from the week Thomas Pendleton allegedly signed this document. More importantly, we have a forensic analysis of the ink used on page 4, the page specifying the liquidation rights." I sat frozen, watching Clara weave through the legal web. But my heart sank as Judge Vance flipped through her submissions. He frowned, shaking his head slowly. "Ms. Vance," Judge Vance said, his voice heavy, "while your financial timeline shows a suspicious coincidence regarding the timing of this claim, the ink analysis is inconclusive regarding forgery. The signature on the primary execution page matches Thomas Pendleton's verified signatures from that era. In probate law, without definitive proof of fraud or a subsequent revocable instrument, the existing trust deed must stand. Do you have any direct evidence that Thomas Pendleton revoked this trust or altered its terms before his passing?" A heavy, suffocating weight pressed down on my chest. Julian leaned back in his chair, a smirk slowly spreading across his face. Eleanor let out a soft, elegant sigh of relief. They had won. The house, my sanctuary, my grandfather's memory, it was all going to be erased by bulldozers. Clara looked back at me, her eyes filled with a sudden, devastating helplessness. She had exhausted every mathematical avenue. The math was failing against the law. The judge raised his gavel, preparing to bring it down to end the matter. Based on the evidence presented, suddenly, the small brass key in my pocket felt incredibly hot against my leg. A memory flashed through my mind, a memory of my grandfather's workshop, the smell of oil and old wood, and his final words to me. "When the world loses its rhythm, this will reset the gears." I stood up. "Your Honor," I spoke out, my voice breaking the courtroom protocol. "Arthur, sit down," Julian's attorney barked. "Mr. Pendleton, you must speak through your counsel," Judge Vance said, holding his gavel mid-air. "Please, Your Honor," I said, walking toward the center aisle. "My grandfather was a structural engineer before he retired. He didn't believe in loose ends. He gave me something 15 years ago, and I never understood what it was for until this exact moment." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the tarnished brass key. I walked to the evidence table and placed it gently on the wood. "What is the relevance of this, Mr. Pendleton?" Judge Vance asked, his curiosity piqued despite himself. "This key doesn't fit a door, Your Honor," I said, my voice steadying, gaining a resonance that surprised even me. "It fits a hidden locking mechanism inside the grandfather clock that currently sits in the living room of 1402 Ridgeview Drive. The clock that my grandfather built with his own hands. The clock that my brother and mother have never looked at twice because they only see the value of things they can sell." Julian stood up, his face flushing red. "This is absurd. He's stalling. It's an old piece of junk." "Sit down, Mr. Pendleton," Judge Vance roared, pointing a stern finger at Julian. The room fell into an icy silence. The judge looked at me, then at the key. "What is inside that clock, Arthur?" "The real truth, Your Honor," I said. "The missing gear?" Judge Vance did something unprecedented. Sensing the deep emotional fracture and the potential for a massive miscarriage of justice, he ordered a 1-hour recess and commanded the bailiff to accompany me, Clara, Julian, and their attorney to the house on Ridgeview Drive to retrieve the clock's contents. The drive was silent, filled with a tension so thick it felt physical. When we arrived at the house, the rain had stopped, but the air was cold and crisp. We walked into the living room. The grand French clock stood tall in the corner, its pendulum swinging with that same deep, comforting rhythm. Thump, 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 thump. Julian stood near the doorway, his arms crossed, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "You're making a fool of yourself, Arthur. There's nothing in there." I didn't answer him. I walked up to the clock. I opened the long glass door, exposing the heavy brass weights and the swinging pendulum. I reached my hand deep into the top casing, behind the dial plate, where my grandfather had spent months assembling the intricate gear train. My fingers searched the dark wood until they found it, a tiny circular indentation hidden behind the moon phase indicator. It was a keyhole, completely invisible from the outside. I inserted the tarnished brass key. It fit perfectly. With a slow, deliberate twist, a satisfying click echoed through the wooden casing. A small spring-loaded panel at the base of the clock popped open, revealing a velvet-lined compartment that hadn't seen daylight in 15 years. Inside lay a single, sealed parchment envelope and a small leather-bound journal. I handed the envelope directly to the court bailiff, who placed it in a secure evidence bag. We returned to courtroom 3 billions immediately. When the court reconvened, Eleanor was back in her seat, though her posture was no longer confident. Her hands were trembling slightly as she watched Judge Vance use a silver letter opener to break the seal on the parchment envelope. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Judge Vance read the document silently. His expression shifted from professional indifference to absolute cold fury. He looked up from the paper, his gaze locking onto Julian and Eleanor, like a laser. "This court is back in session," Judge Vance said, his voice dripping with ice. "I have just read the certified, fully executed amendment to the Pendleton Family Trust, dated 48 hours before Thomas Pendleton's passing. By an affidavit signed by his primary physician, confirming his absolute mental competency at the time of execution." The judge cleared his throat, his voice echoing off the oak walls. "In this document, Thomas Pendleton explicitly states, knowing that my daughter Eleanor and my grandson Julian possess a desire for wealth that outweighs their integrity, I hereby revoke all their rights, titles, and interests in any property connected to the Pendleton name. I leave the entirety of my estate, including the land and structure at 1402 Ridgeview Drive, solely and exclusively to my grandson, Arthur Pendleton. He is the only one who understands that a home, like a family, requires time, care, and a true heart to maintain." Julian collapsed into his chair, his face entirely bloodless. Henderson, his attorney, slowly closed his briefcase, realizing the catastrophic ruin that had just occurred. But the judge wasn't finished. He opened the small leather-bound journal. "Furthermore," Judge Vance continued, his voice growing dangerously low, "this journal contains detailed records kept by Thomas Pendleton during his final months. It details a systematic scheme by Julian Pendleton to embezzle over $400,000 from his grandfather's personal savings accounts, while he was hospitalized money that was used to fund Julian's first failed venture. This document isn't just a property deed, Mr. Henderson. It is a roadmap to elder financial abuse. The emotional reversal was total. The villain wasn't just a greedy brother trying to take a house. He was a desperate thief who had been exposed by the very grandfather he thought he had outsmarted. "Your Honor?" Henderson stammered, his face turning pale. We were unaware of these records. This court finds the plaintiff's claim not only entirely without merit, but fraudulent in its inception, Judge Vance declared. He picked up his gavel. The deed is confirmed exclusively in Arthur Pendleton's name. I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal investigation into fraud and grand theft. The gavel struck the block with a resounding crack. The judge ended it in exactly 5 minutes. Eleanor and Julian were led out of the courtroom by their attorneys, completely ignoring the reporters who had gathered in the hallway. They didn't look at me as they passed. They were finally completely silent. Clara and I walked out of the courthouse into the fading afternoon light. The clouds had parted, allowing a warm golden sunset to flood the city streets. We walked down the stone steps together, the heavy weight that had rested on my shoulders for 15 years finally evaporating into the air. We drove back to Ridgeview Drive. The house looked different now. It looked truly mine. The ancient weeping willows swayed gently in the evening breeze, their leaves catching the amber light. We walked inside and the grandfather clock welcomed us with its steady, unbroken heartbeat. I walked over to it, pulled the brass key from my pocket, and placed it on the mantelpiece right beside the clock where it would always remain, no longer a hidden secret, but a monument to justice and love. Clara came up beside me, her hands slipping into mine. Her fingers were warm, intertwining with my calloused ones. We didn't need to speak. The silence between us was no longer filled with questions or fear. It was filled with peace, healing, and a beautiful, unwritten future. The house was finally quiet. And for the first time in my life, the rhythm was perfect. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that the truth will always find its way to the light, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable cinematic stories, and share it with someone who needs a reminder today that justice and healing are always worth fighting for. Thank you for listening.